We're back for your ears only. I'm Melissa Exelberth.
I'm David Alpern with this quote from the news. It's what we call the mobile catch-22. That was media analyst Richard Greenfield on the effort at Facebook, whose initial stock offering has lost half its value, to develop mobile applications that provide better advertiser displays on small screens without angering users. Also last week, Apple won more than $1 billion in damages from Samsung for infringing on patents for its mobile devices. Warning as well to other competitors, Google especially, in its Android smartphone software. Now this.
Listen, these taxes that are being proposed will cost our nation 4.5 million jobs. In Massachusetts alone, over 100,000 workers will lose their jobs.
I think people at the top ought to pay their fair share, corporations ought to pay their fair share, and that we ought to have tax cuts for middle-class families.
They disagree sharply on many national policies, but in their battle for a U.S. Senate seat from Massachusetts, Republican incumbent Scott Brown and Democratic challenger Elizabeth Warren agree that independent media spending by super PACs and other partisan groups does more harm than good. And to the surprise of political professionals around the country, the competing candidates have kept to a pact that keeps such outside advertising out.
At least partly as a result, the Massachusetts Senate race also has been less negative than many around the country. Boston Globe political reporter Noah Bierman wrote about that and other aspects of the campaign last week, and for your ears only, he joins us now. Welcome to our program.
Thanks, David. How are you?
Good. Start by explaining the mechanism both candidates agreed on to prevent outside media spending, basically penalties their own campaigns have to pay if that happens.
That's right. If somebody puts up an ad that purports or doesn't even purport, that seems to help Scott Brown or hurt Elizabeth Warren, then Elizabeth Warren or somebody would call this ad out. They'd figure out the value of it, and Scott Brown would have to donate half of the value of the ad to a charity of Warren's choice. And the same would be, obviously, in the opposite scenario where something benefits Warren. She'd have to make the donation.
And has either campaign had to pay a penalty so far?
There have been. But they've been pretty small, and it's almost been a way to prove that it works, in a sense. They've been in the tens of thousands of dollars, 2 fines that Scott Brown has had to pay.
By contrast, give us some sense of the magnitude of independent ad buys still going on in other Senate races around the country.
Basically, half dozen to a dozen that are considered competitive, and about 16 where there are Senate races that are outside groups are spending money in some form or another. And so far, there's been about $90 million spent, and you can expect at least double that by the time that we get to the election.
To what degree and why has the bar to outside media buys meant a less negative tone to the campaign in Massachusetts?
Well, there's been still some attacks that the candidates themselves have lodged against each other, but they haven't been in the advertisements, and that tends to be where things can get very negative. And not that they won't, but oftentimes it's a little easier when it's some outside group who's throwing an old lady off the side of a cliff for the candidate to disavow that ad than it is if they've got to say, this is Scott Brown, this is Elizabeth Warren, and I approve this message. They don't have to. They would have to do that if they wanted to run something that was negative or beyond the pale. And at this point, they haven't been willing to risk doing that.
Both Brown and Warren have no shortage of campaign funds, so the PAC disadvantaged neither financially. But you say the mutual reluctance to go negative was a plus for Warren because of her past claims of minority status as partly Native American. Remind us about that.
Yeah, there was in the spring, around April-May area, there were a lot of news stories about how Elizabeth Warren had considered herself part Native American without any documentation and had listed herself on some legal directories that have been used at times to make employment, by employers to look for minorities. The universities have said that wasn't a factor in her hiring, but it's something that has been an inconvenience at the least to her campaign, and you can imagine the negative ads that could be associated with that, and there haven't been any, and probably partly as a result of this pledge or pact.
This pact has also benefited the candidates' political consultants in terms of message control and their own finances.
That's right. Everybody thinks that the outside groups are a pure blessing to the candidates, and they often are. They're very helpful, especially if a candidate is underfinanced. But the people who are actually controlling the campaigns, they would much rather have complete control of what kind of message goes out on behalf of their candidates, which they do in this case. And then the thing that's talked about even less is that they make a lot of their money by being the ones that place the ads. They end up having relationships with media buying firms, or they themselves are a media buying firm. And so by having control over all of the candidates' money and all the candidates' messaging, they have quite a bit more control over their finances as well.
And quite a better take in their own profits. Would the Pact cover outside spending on aspects of the campaign other than media, grassroots organizing, and finally get out the vote drives?
No, it doesn't. And in fact, the group founded by Karl Rove, Crossroads, protested the Pact early on because of that. It said that Democrats would have an advantage because they tend to have unions able to mobilize on their behalf. But it does not cover that. The idea that the candidates had, or at least that they agreed to, was that you can't stop people from knocking on doors and saying, I want you to vote for my candidate. That seems sort of like old-fashioned democracy. And Republican groups are getting in on that act, too. So, it may not be even, but certainly both sides will continue to try to organize and have canvassing and all the things that you do in that regard.
Are there signs that outside media money is just biding its time before coming in, maybe so late that the Pact can't do very much to counter it?
That's certainly a lot of speculation, and there's a belief, especially if one candidate pulls away in the polls. Right now, they still remain pretty close. Brown, in some recent polls, has had a little bit of an edge, 5 points in one that came out last week. But that's still within the toss-up range. But if one candidate really starts to seem to pull ahead, there's belief among a lot of people that some of these outside groups will say, to heck with it. We're going to go in and spend our money. We don't want to go, we want to go down fighting.
The Brown-Warren race also proved particularly responsive to last week's resurgent focus on rape and abortion, thanks to the remarks of Republican Senate candidate Todd Akin of Missouri and a no-exceptions plank on abortion placed in the GOP platform. What was Brown's reaction?
Well, Brown was actually one of the first prominent Republicans and the first senator to urge Akin to get out of the Senate race. And Warren still came back and said, there are some issues where women's groups are more supportive of me than they are of you, and you are tied to the National Republican Party that, she tried to paint Akin, Paul Ryan, Mitt Romney, all of the same cloth.
Hasn't Brown been distancing himself from the party, though, for some time, as Mitt Romney did in his successful run for governor and indeed his losing fight for Senate against Ted Kennedy?
That's right. Brown has worked really hard to convey to people that he's independent and not somebody who's a party line voter, which is important in Massachusetts because Democrats have a very large registration advantage over Republicans. So you need some Democrats to be willing to say, I want to give this guy a shot. And then independents, who make up the largest voting group in the state, you really need to win them by a big margin if you're a Republican. And the way to do that is to talk about your own independence. And Brown's been pretty successful at conveying that message. Now, Warren says it's a false message, but we'll see. That'll really be what turns the election, which way voters respond to that.
Boston Globe political reporter Noah Bierman.
Quote from the news, "I do not care if he is insane or not as long as he gets the punishment that he deserves." That was Alexandra Peltry, an 18-year-old Norwegian on the maximum 21-year sentence for Anders Breivik, who killed 77 people and wounded her at an island youth camp last July as a protest against immigrants and multiculturalism. By finding Breivik sane, the court forced attention on white supremacist philosophy spreading around the continent, which will probably keep the convict in jail as long as he continues to espouse it.
Next, inside the West Nile epidemic, for your ears only.